Hey there. Tonight, we slip behind the tall white columns of a great London house in the middle of the season, past the waiting carriages, and the gas lamps, and the footmen yawning in the hall, into a world of white gowns, trembling curtseys, whispered matches, and mothers watching everything with the quiet focus of generals at war. Tonight, you become a Victorian debutante. 17 years old, dressed in white, and about to be presented to society as a thing that is, very politely, for sale. The most fussed-over girl in England. And, as you're about to discover, quite possibly the most terrified. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure here ever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered across the world, settling in under the blankets together, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights. Sink into your pillows. Let your shoulders go heavy. And let's step gently back into a single day in the life of a debutante. A day that begins, as so many of hers do, with a flutter of pure dread. Congratulations. You have just woken up as a Victorian debutante. The good news: you are young, you are well-born, and after years of being shut away upstairs with a governess, you are finally about to be let out into the wide, glittering world. The bad news: that world has exactly one question for you. It intends to ask it for an entire summer, and the question is, very simply, who will marry you, and how much will it cost? You are not a person beginning her life. You are, in the eyes of nearly everyone, a deal about to be done. But that's all to come. For now, you are 18, or near enough, lying in a narrow bed in your family's London house, and today is the day you have been pointed toward your entire life. Today, you are to be presented at court. Today, you will be carried in a slow carriage to the palace, dressed in white from head to toe, and you will sink into the deepest curtsey of your life before your queen. And if you wobble, if you trip on your own train, if your nerve fails you in front of the most powerful woman in the world, you will remember it, with a small inward cringe, until the day you die. So no, you do not leap out of bed feeling fresh. You wake with your stomach already in a knot, to the sound of a maid setting down a can of warm water, and the faint, far-off sound of your mother, already awake, already dressed, already worrying, moving through the house like weather. Your mother. Let's talk about your mother, because for the next few months, she is the single most important force in your existence, more present than God and considerably more demanding. Your mother has spent years, and a frightening amount of money preparing for this season. She has rented this London house for the spring. She has hired the carriage, ordered the gowns, studied the guest lists, traded favors, called on duchesses she privately can't stand, and lain awake doing sums. Her entire campaign, and it is a campaign, has one objective: to see you well married by autumn. Not happily married. Well married. The two are related the way a cousin is related to you, occasionally, and not closely. If she pulls it off, she is a genius, and you are a triumph. If she fails, the failure will be whispered to be yours. So when she sweeps into your room this morning, already in full battle dress, and looks you up and down with a cool, assessing eye of a woman appraising a horse she is about to take to market, try not to take it personally. She loves you. She does. It's only that love, in your world, looks a great deal like inspection. And now begins the dressing, and oh, the dressing. because you are not simply putting on a nice gown today. You are being assembled into a court presentation outfit, and the court presentation outfit is a small architectural project governed by rules so strict and so strange that breaking them can get you turned away at the palace door. First, the rules. Your gown must be white, or very nearly, the white of innocence, of unmarried emptiness, of a clean page nobody has written on yet. It must have a low neckline and short sleeves, no matter the weather, no matter that it is a raw English spring, and you will spend hours in a draughty carriage. Bare arms. That is the rule. Then, the train, a long, heavy train, several feet of it, that hangs from your shoulders and pulls behind you on the floor, regulated almost to the inch by the rules of the court. And finally, rising from your carefully arranged hair, the feathers. 3 white ostrich plumes, worn at the back of the head, because the queen wishes it, and the queen's wishes are not so much requests as facts of nature. You will go before your sovereign dressed as a kind of human wedding cake, plumed like a small startled bird, and you will be expected to move in it with grace. It does not feel graceful. It feels like wearing a tent attached to a flag. But your maid and your mother work over you with the grim efficiency of stagehands before a premiere, and slowly, layer by layer, the girl disappears and the offering takes her place. The corset, of course, comes first, because today, of all days, your waist must be small, your back straight, your whole figure a smooth, controlled line. It is laced firmly, and as the breath is gently squeezed out of you, you are reminded of the first great lesson of your new life. Comfort is not the point. You are not dressing to feel well. You are dressing to be looked at. The two have almost nothing to do with each other. Over the corset go the layers, the chemise, the petticoats, the white gown itself, settling over you like snowfall. Then the long gloves, drawn up past the elbow, because a lady's bare hand in public is a small scandal all its own. Then the jewels your mother has decided you may wear, modest ones, nothing that outshines a married woman, because a debutante who glitters too brightly looks like she is trying too hard, and trying too hard is, somehow, the worst sin of all. You must seem effortless. You must seem as though you simply woke up like this, a vision in white, when in fact it has taken 3 people the better part of 2 hours, and you can no longer fully fill your lungs. And then, at last, the train is pinned, the feathers are fixed, the gloves smoothed, and you are turned to face the long mirror. And there she is. Not you exactly. A version of you. Pale, plumed, perfect, and faintly unreal. A girl carved into the shape of what society has decided a marriageable young woman ought to be. Your mother stands behind you, and for one moment her hard expression softens, and she says, quietly, that you look lovely. And you do. That's the strange thing. You really do. It's only that, lovely, is now your job. But before you can be looked at, you must learn how to be looked at, and this is where the lessons come in, the long, peculiar education that has been quietly shaping you for this single day. Because being a debutante is a performance, and you have been in rehearsal for years without quite realizing it. You have been taught to walk, not your ordinary walk, but the gliding, level walk of a lady, as though you were carrying a book on your head and a secret in your chest, your steps small, your skirts moving but your shoulders still. You have been taught to sit, lowering yourself into a chair without ever appearing to fold or collapse, arranging your skirts in a single practice motion. You have been taught to enter a room, which is its own art, neither too fast, which looks eager, nor too slow, which looks grand, and to cross it under the gaze of strangers without once letting your face show that you know you are being watched. And above all, you have been taught the curtsey. The curtsey is the whole performance in miniature, and today, before the Queen, you must execute the deepest and most perfect one of your life. It is not a little bob. It is a slow, controlled descent, one foot drawn behind the other, the knees bending, the body lowering almost to the floor, the head inclined just so, and then, the truly difficult part, the rise. Smooth, unhurried. With several feet of heavy train behind you and 3 feathers nodding above you, balanced on legs you can no longer feel, in a corset that will not let you breathe. You have practiced this for weeks. You have curtsied to your mother, to your governess, to the back of a chair. And still, the thought of doing it for real, with the whole court watching, makes your mouth go dry. There were other lessons too, of course, the long, patient, expensive lessons that fill a young lady's education. A little French, so you may murmur a phrase and seem cultured. A little Italian, for the songs. The piano, so that after dinner you may be asked to play, and play just well enough to be charming but never so well as to seem like you take it seriously, because a woman who is truly good at something is faintly alarming. A little drawing, a little singing, the careful copying of poetry into an album, embroidery, endless embroidery. These were called your accomplishments, and that word tells you everything, because an accomplishment is not a skill you use. It is a feather in a different sense, a decoration, a thing to display, proof that you are the sort of girl worth a great deal of money to keep. What you were not taught is anything that might let you live on your own. You cannot manage money. You have never held any. You do not know what things cost. You could not cook a meal, light a proper fire, or survive a single week without the small army of people who dress you and feed you and carry things for you. You have been raised, with enormous care and at enormous expense, to be utterly, beautifully helpless. And today you go out into the world to find the man who will take over your keeping from your father. That is the deal. That has always been the deal. Nobody says it out loud, because saying it out loud would spoil the lovely white dress. And now the carriage is at the door. You go down the stairs slowly, you must, with the train, and out into the gray London morning, where the family carriage waits, polished to a shine, the horses stamping. And here you meet the first great ordeal of the day, which is not the Queen at all. It is the waiting. For the road to the palace, on a presentation day, is choked with carriages, hundreds of them, all carrying girls exactly like you, plumed and pale and sick with nerves, inching forward at the pace of a funeral. You may sit in that carriage for 2 hours, sometimes 3, hardly moving, while crowds gather on the pavements to peer in at the debutantes, to point, and comment, and rate you like livestock at a fair. Strangers press their faces toward the glass. Boys jeer. And you must sit there, on display, smiling faintly, pretending you cannot hear, your bare arms cold, your bladder a growing tragedy you dare not mention, because a lady does not mention such things, and certainly not on the way to meet her queen. By the time the carriage finally rolls through the palace gates, you have been awake for hours, eaten almost nothing. You wouldn't dare, not in this corset, not with these nerves, and you are running entirely on terror and good posture. You are handed down. Your train is gathered over your arm, and you are swept into the palace, into a great gilded crush of other debutantes and their mothers, all funneling slowly toward a single set of doors, beyond which waits the moment your entire upbringing has been pointing at. You wait again, of course. You always wait. You stand in a long, shuffling line in a hot, crowded antechamber, the air thick with perfume and panic, your feathers slipping, your feet aching, married women gliding past with the maddening calm of people who survived this years ago. You hear, faintly, the murmur from the room ahead. You try to remember everything at once: the curtsey, the train, the rise. Do not trip, do not faint, do not catch the Queen's eye too boldly, do not fail to catch it at all. And the line shuffles forward, and a footman takes your train and spreads it out behind you in one practiced sweep, and someone says your name aloud to the room, and quite suddenly there is no more waiting left. You step through the doors. And there she is. Small, round, and black, unsmiling, the Queen. The most powerful woman on earth, empress of a quarter of the planet, looking faintly bored, because she has watched several hundred girls do exactly this today, and will watch several hundred more. The whole room is watching. Your mother is watching. England, it feels like, is watching. And you walk forward, across the impossible distance of the floor, on legs that belong to someone braver than you, and you stop, and you sink into the deepest curtsey of your life. Down you go, slow and controlled, the feathers dipping, the train pooling, the breath caught in your chest. For one held moment you are there, at the bottom, your head bowed before your sovereign, the whole weight of your world balanced on two trembling knees. And then, the rise. Smooth. Do not wobble. Do not put out a hand. Up, up, level and serene, as though you do this every morning before breakfast. The Queen gives the smallest possible nod. It is over in seconds. And then comes the part nobody warned you about, the truly diabolical part. You may not turn your back on the Queen. You must withdraw backwards, retreating across the vast floor in reverse, managing several feet of train behind you that you cannot see, in front of everyone, without once looking down. Girls have stumbled here. Girls have trodden on their own hems, and sat down hard in front of the entire court. But not you. Not today. You back away, smooth and slow, train somehow flowing, until at last you are through the far doors, out of the royal gaze, and only then do you let yourself breathe, a great shaking gulp of air, your heart going like a drum, your eyes stinging with the relief of it. You did it. You were presented. And the strangest part is this: nothing happened. The Queen does not remember your name. She has already nodded at the next girl. There was no test, no question, no prize. You spent weeks in terror, hours in a carriage, a fortune on white silk, all for 10 seconds of bowing to a tired woman in black. And yet, everything has changed. Because you walked into that room a girl, a child kept upstairs, and you walked out of it a debutante. You are, in the language of your world, finally, out. And being out changes everything. Before today, you were nobody in the social sense, a girl invisible, not to be spoken to as an adult, not to be invited anywhere that mattered. Now, suddenly, you exist. You may attend balls. You may be introduced to gentlemen. You may dance. You may be courted. The doors of every great drawing-room in London swing open to you, but only for a while. Because here is the cruel arithmetic at the center of your new life. The season is short, your bloom is shorter, and the clock has just started running. You have a summer. Perhaps 2 or 3, if your family is patient and your prospects don't sour. After that, an unmarried girl begins to look a little wilted, a little desperate, a little like a question nobody answered, and the world, which fussed over you so tenderly this morning, will quietly begin to look away. And how cruelly short that window is, once you understand it. A girl is freshest, most prized, most full of promise, in her very first season, new, untried, a clean page, the object of every speculating glance. If she does not secure a match that year, she returns for a second season a little less novel, the bloom just perceptibly dimmed, and the whispers begin, gentle at first. Why is she not yet settled? Is there something amiss? Was there some disappointment? By a third season, an unmarried girl carries a faint air of failure about her that no amount of beauty can quite dispel, like a lovely dish that has sat too long on the table. It is monstrously unfair. She may have refused unworthy offers, or simply had no luck, or fallen for a man her family forbade, but fairness has nothing to do with it. The market price is freshness, and you cannot stay fresh. So the clock is not a gentle thing ticking somewhere in the background. It is a hand at your back, pushing, and your mother feels it even more keenly than you do, because she knows, as you are only beginning to learn, that a girl has but a few brief summers to decide the entire shape of the rest of her life, and that the summers do not come back. So no time to rest. The morning was only the beginning. Tonight there is a ball, and tomorrow there are calls to pay, and the day after that a luncheon, and a drive in the park, and another ball, and another, a glittering, exhausting, breathless treadmill of an existence, every event a small audition, every dance a tiny negotiation, every conversation watched and weighed and reported on by people you will never see. Welcome to the season. You are out now. The hunt has begun, and you, my dear, in your lovely white dress, are not entirely sure whether you are the huntress or the prize. But before we follow you into the ballroom, let's sit for a moment in the strange, slow texture of your ordinary days, because for all the glitter of the season, a great deal of a debutante's life is simply waiting. The grand events come at night, but the days between them are long and curiously empty, hemmed in by rules, and filled with the small, soft, supervised occupations thought suitable for a young lady. You rise late by the standards of the working world, and the morning is given to the toilette, the unhurried business of being washed, dressed, and arranged, and to a little breakfast you barely touch. And then you wait. You write letters, in your careful copperplate hand, to relatives and friends, for correspondence is one of the few proper outlets a girl has. You take up your everlasting needlework, the embroidery that fills 1,000 idle female hours across the century. You practice the piano for the evening, just enough. You read, but only what you are permitted, for novels are watched, and a book thought too exciting or too modern may be quietly removed from your reach. You may walk in the garden, if there is one, or be driven out, but you may not simply go where you please. Hour after hour, the gilded day stretches on, and you fill it with these gentle, pointless accomplishments, a clever young woman with a quick mind and nothing real to do with it, waiting for the evening, when at last something will be permitted to happen. And there is the hair. We must not forget the hair, because the architecture of a fashionable Victorian head is a marvel of patient labor, and most of it is performed on you while you sit very still and think of other things. Your hair is long. It has never been cut, for a woman's hair is her glory, and to crop it would be near scandalous, and each day it must be brushed out, the 100 dutiful strokes, then oiled, then dressed and pinned into the elaborate shape the moment demands, smoothed and parted in the day, built up into curls and coils and ornaments by night, threaded with flowers or jewels or, for the great occasions, those nodding feathers. It takes an age. It requires a maid with skilled and patient hands, and a great quantity of pins, and sometimes false pieces, and pads to build the fashionable fullness. And you submit to all of it, daily, the long ritual of being made beautiful from the scalp down, because your appearance is not your own private affair. It is your work, your advertisement, the very thing on which your future is staked. And none of it, not the hair, not the gowns, not the long idle elegant days, would be possible for a single hour without the people you are trained never quite to see. Beneath your gilded life runs a whole hidden world of labor, an army of servants who rise in the cold and dark to make your ease possible. There is your lady's maid, closest of them all, who dresses and undresses you, who tends your clothes and your hair and your endless small needs, who knows your body and your moods more intimately than almost anyone, and who is, all the same, a servant, addressed by her surname, sleeping in a narrow attic room, expected to be invisible the moment she is not required. There are the housemaids who lay and light the fires before you wake, so that you may open your eyes to a warm room and imagine the warmth simply happened. There are the kitchen staff, down in the hot basement, preparing the meals you will barely touch. There are the laundry maids ruining their hands over your delicate things, the footmen carrying your messages, the coachman waiting in the cold for hours while you dance. A great house is an iceberg, and you are the small bright peak of it that shows above the water. The vast, dim, freezing bulk that keeps you afloat is made of human beings, most of them women, many of them younger than you, whose whole lives are spent making yours look effortless. You have been raised not to think about them, to accept their labor the way you accept the air, and that, too, is part of your education, the art of being served so completely that you forget you are being served at all. It is worth remembering them, here in the dark, the unseen girls on the cold side of the gilded door, because they were the true engine of the whole beautiful, impossible world, and history has been even quieter about them than it has about you. Now, with the days mapped, let's begin with the first rule of your new public life, the rule that hangs over everything else. You are never, ever alone. Not for a moment. From the day you came out until the day you marry, you move through the world inside an invisible cage made of one person, your chaperone. Usually your mother. Sometimes a married aunt, or a hired older woman of good character, or a trusted married friend. But always someone. She sits with you at every ball, watching the edges of the room. She rides with you in every carriage. She hovers at the corner of every conversation you have with a man, close enough to hear, far enough to pretend she isn't listening. You may not walk down a street by yourself. You may not receive a gentleman alone. You may not so much as read certain novels without an eyebrow being raised. Your reputation, that fragile, priceless, entirely unfair thing, must be guarded every single second, because it can be ruined in one, and once ruined it cannot be repaired. And so you learn to live observed. You learn that a moment alone with a man in a conservatory, however innocent, however brief, can end your prospects forever, not because anything happened, but because it could be said to have happened, and in your world, being talked about and being guilty are very nearly the same crime. You learn that everything you do is a kind of evidence. The way you laugh. How long you speak to a particular gentleman. Whether you dance with him twice, which is a signal, or 3 times, which is practically a scandal. There are no private moments. There is only the performance, and the audience, and your mother's eyes finding you across the room with the unfailing accuracy of a lighthouse. Which brings us, at last, to the ballroom, the great glittering theater where the real business of the season is done. Tonight you will attend your first proper ball, and it is a sight to take your breath away, or it would be if your corset hadn't taken it already. A great London house ablaze with light, 1,000 candles, or the dazzling new gas lamps throwing gold across the walls. Flowers everywhere, banked in heaps, the air heavy with their scent. An orchestra tuning in the gallery. Footmen in livery. And the people, hundreds of them, the women in silk of every color, the men in black and white, the whole glittering crush of London society packed into a few hot, perfumed rooms, all of them watching all of the others, all of the time. And you, in your white debutante gown, because you will wear white or the palest pastels for your first seasons, the colors of the unclaimed, are led in on your mother's arm, and presented, and absorbed into the throng. And immediately you discover the central instrument of your fate for the evening, the dance card. It is a small, pretty thing, dangling from your wrist on a ribbon, a tiny booklet with a tiny pencil, and on it are listed the dances of the night, the quadrille, the waltz, the polka, the gallop. As gentlemen are introduced to you, they may request a dance, and if you accept, your name and his are written in, slotted into the evening like appointments. And that little card, that scrap of paper and ribbon, is about to become the most important object in your world, because a full card means you are a success, sought after, in demand, a girl the men want to be seen with. And an empty card means the unthinkable. It means you are a wallflower. There is no word in your world quite so quietly dreadful. The wallflower is the girl who sits at the edge of the room, against the wall, her card blank, her mother's smile growing tighter and more desperate by the hour, watching the other girls swept away into the dance again and again, while she is passed over, and passed over, and passed over. No man asks her. And the longer she sits, the harder it becomes, because men are creatures of the herd, and a girl no one else wants begins to seem like a girl there must be some reason not to want. It is unfair. It is often cruel. A girl may sit there for no reason at all but shyness, or a plain face, or a small dowry, or simple bad luck, and still the verdict settles over her like a chill. And there is nothing she can do. She cannot ask a man to dance. That is unthinkable. She can only sit, and smile, and wait, and pray, and feel the whole bright room turn slowly into a stage on which she is failing in front of everyone she knows. And here is a thing worth understanding about the room you are standing in. You did not simply walk into it. Someone decided to let you in. For society, in your world, is not an open field but a fortress, and its gates are guarded by a small number of immensely powerful women, the great hostesses, the grand ladies whose invitations are the difference between belonging and not belonging at all. To be asked to the right balls, to be admitted to the most exclusive assemblies, a girl and her family must win the favor of these gatekeepers, and that favor is given or withheld with absolute, queenly authority on grounds that can be as solid as rank or as flimsy as a whim. A single one of these women, taking against your mother over some old slight, can quietly shut doors that no amount of money or beauty will open again. A word of approval from the right one can make your whole season. They are the true sovereigns of this glittering little kingdom, more feared in their way than the queen herself, for the queen merely receives you once, while they decide whether you will be invited anywhere worth going for the rest of the summer. So even your presence here tonight, in this bright and crowded room, is not a right but a permission, granted by some formidable lady watching from a sofa near the fire, who could, with a lifted eyebrow, undo you. You smile at her very carefully indeed. So tonight, as the music starts, you feel the terror of the card keenly. You watch the gentlemen circulate. You feel your mother steering, maneuvering, finding the right people to introduce you to, deploying you across the room like a piece on a board. And when at last a young man bows before you and asks for the honor of a dance, the rush of relief is almost dizzying, and you write his name in your little book, and take his arm, and step out onto the floor under the eyes of all of London. But even the dancing is a minefield, because of course it is. Everything is. There are rules for how a gentleman may hold you in the waltz, and the waltz itself was, until recently, thought rather shocking, this business of a man's hand actually on a woman's waist. There are rules for what you may and may not say while you dance. You may discuss the weather. You may discuss the music, the flowers, the heat of the room, the crush of the crowd, the last ball, the next ball. You may offer a light, pretty, harmless remark and receive one in return. What you may not do is say anything real. You may not be too clever. A clever girl is unsettling, and a man does not wish to feel outmatched by the creature he is considering purchasing. You may not be too dull, either, or too forward, or too cold, or too warm. You must be charming, which means you must be pleasant and agreeable, and just interesting enough to be remembered and not 1 degree more. You are performing a personality designed by committee, and the committee is every mother who has ever lived. And all the while, beneath the music and the flowers and the pretty talk of the weather, the real thing is happening, the thing nobody names. Because the ball is not a party. The ball is a market. And you are not a guest. You are the goods. Let's be honest about it, here in the dark, where honesty is allowed. The entire glittering machine of the season exists for one purpose: to arrange marriages between families of property, in such a way that land stays with land, money meets money, or rescues a great name gone short of it, and the whole careful structure of the aristocracy is passed down intact to the next generation. You are the instrument of that. Your marriage is not, at heart, about your happiness, and certainly not about love, though everyone will speak of love a great deal because it makes the transaction smell sweeter. Your marriage is a merger. And your value in that merger has been calculated, quite precisely, by people doing sums in quiet rooms. Your beauty is part of it, yes. Your charm, your accomplishments, your family's name. But the cold number at the heart of it is your dowry, the money or property your father will settle on you, that will pass to your husband when you marry. A great fortune can make a plain girl suddenly fascinating. A small one can make a beauty mysteriously easy to overlook. The men, too, are priced by their land, their title, their income, their expectations. And the mothers, on both sides, are the true players of the game, circling each ballroom doing arithmetic behind their fans, weighing this match against that one, this income against that title, with the cold precision of bankers and the warm smiles of friends. You feel young and full of dreams. You are on the ledger, a line item. Both things are true at once, and the trick of surviving your season is to never quite let yourself look directly at the second one. And the stakes of that arithmetic, in your century, were quietly enormous, because the grand old families were not always as rich as their houses made them look. A great estate, the vast house, the parks, the farms, the small army of servants, devoured money at a frightening rate, and as the century wore on and agricultural fortunes wavered, more and more noble families found themselves land-rich and cash-poor, rattling around their palaces with the roof leaking and the rents falling, and the old way of life growing harder to afford. For such a family, a son's good marriage was not a luxury but a rescue, and a daughter's was a piece of careful estate management. And it was precisely this hunger that opened the door, in your lifetime, to a remarkable new figure on the marriage market, the American heiress. For across the ocean, the great new fortunes of American industry and railroads and finance were producing daughters with dowries beyond the dreams of any English squire, girls whose fathers would pay handsomely, gladly, to see them transformed into duchesses and countesses, trading raw new money for the one thing money could not manufacture, an ancient title, and a place at the very summit of the oldest society on earth. They came in their numbers, these dollar princesses, and some of them you will meet tonight, and the trade in them was as frank, beneath the romance, as any cattle auction. So much gold, settled on the estate, in exchange for a coronet and a great name gone short of funds. It made some of those girls miserable, and some of them magnificent, and occasionally both. But it tells you, with brutal clarity, what the whole gilded machine was really for. Love was the music. Money was the dance. The day after a ball, the work continues, in daylight, more quietly, through the strange ritual of the morning call. Although it is called a morning call, it happens in the afternoon, because your world runs on its own logic and, morning, means roughly, before dinner. You and your mother, dressed with great care, climb into the carriage and go from house to house, paying brief, formal visits, 15 minutes, no more, to the families you wish to stay close to. And if the people you call on are not at home, or are not at home, which is a different and more interesting thing, you leave a card. The calling card. A small printed rectangle with your name on it, dropped on a silver tray in the hall, and the entire society runs on these things like a postal service of pure status. Whose card is left for whom, whose call is returned and how quickly, whether a corner is turned down, and what that turned corner means, there is an elaborate, unwritten grammar to it all. And to get it wrong is to announce yourself as not quite the thing. You will spend a frankly insane amount of your life delivering and receiving small pieces of cardboard, and somehow the fate of your whole summer rides on it. And then there is the park. Every fashionable afternoon, the great and the good of London converge on Hyde Park, on a particular stretch of it, the famous Rotten Row, to ride and drive and stroll, and above all to be seen. You go in the open carriage, beautifully dressed, your mother beside you, and you process slowly up and down among the other carriages and the riders, nodding to acquaintances, being nodded to, allowing yourself to be looked at by everyone who matters. It is, in a sense, the whole season in miniature. A slow parade of beautiful people pretending to enjoy a drive, while in fact conducting the serious business of display. A gentleman who reins his horse alongside your carriage to exchange a few words is making a statement. A girl seen too often beside the same man is the subject of 100 whispered guesses. You learn to read the park the way a sailor reads weather. And you smile, always, because the smile is the uniform, and you never, ever take it off in public. And the balls, glittering as they are only one front of a much wider campaign, for the London season is a whole calendar of set pieces, a great social machine that turns through the spring and summer with the regularity of the seasons themselves. There are the private balls, and the public ones, yes, but also the grand sporting occasions where society gathers to see and be seen as much as to watch the racing or the rowing. There is the Derby, and there is Royal Ascot, where you parade in your finest summer gowns and most extravagant hats among the very highest in the land, the royal carriages rolling up the course. There is Henley, with its boats and its riverside crowds. There is the opera, where the point is less the music than the boxes, and who is sitting in whose, and who has been seen with whom. There are the garden parties, the regattas, the great public exhibitions. Each is another stage, another chance to be displayed to advantage or to make a costly misstep, and your mother plots your appearance at each like a campaign of war. And then, as the summer wanes and London empties, the whole glittering court decamps to the countryside, to the long round of country house parties that fill the autumn, the shooting parties, the weekend gatherings in great houses, where matches half begun in London ballrooms are quietly concluded over croquet lawns and in candlelit corridors. The season is not an event. It is a year-long hunt with 100 coverts, and you are expected to ride to every one of them, smiling, tireless, on display. And all through it you are surrounded by them, the other girls, your rivals, and your only true companions both at once. For the strange truth of your position is that the very girls you are pitted against, competing for the same dances and the same eligible men, the same scarce supply of good matches, are also the only people on earth who understand exactly what you are going through. You will befriend some of them, genuinely, sharing whispered confidences behind your fans, comparing notes on dreadful partners and impossible mothers, propping one another up through the long, anxious nights. And you will quietly measure yourself against all of them, her gown, her dowry, her dance card, her conquests, set against your own, in a constant, exhausting arithmetic of comparison that no one teaches you and no one has to. Some will marry brilliantly, and some will not marry at all, and the difference between those fates can come down to a fortune, a face, a single piece of luck or gossip, and you all know it, and it sits between you even as you laugh together. It is a sisterhood and a competition in the same breath, and you learn to live inside that contradiction, because there is nowhere else to live. Let's talk, too, about what you eat, or rather, what you don't, because food is its own quiet theater in a debutante's day, and the rules of it are as strange as everything else. You are perpetually gently hungry. Partly this is the corset, which leaves very little room for an actual meal to go. A tightly laced girl who eats heartily will faint, or worse, and fainting at the wrong moment is mortifying. But it is also fashion and morality dressed up together. A delicate appetite is thought refined, even beautiful. The pale, ethereal young lady who merely picks at her plate, who seems to live on air and sentiment, is the romantic ideal of the age. To eat with frank, healthy hunger, to actually enjoy your food in public, is faintly coarse, a little too earthy, the mark of a girl who has not learned to make herself small. So at luncheon, at tea, even at the great dinners, you take tiny portions, you nibble, you push things gracefully around your plate, and you rise from every table just a little emptier than you sat down. You are starving, elegantly, all season long. Later, perhaps, alone in your room, you might quietly eat something a maid has smuggled up. But never, ever where anyone can see. The afternoon, between the morning calls and the evening's ball, brings its own small obligations. The luncheons, the teas, the at-homes, the endless soft machinery of visiting. You learn the elaborate choreography of the tea table, where even the pouring of tea is governed by rules, where a married woman presides and an unmarried girl assists, where every gesture is watched. You learn who may be introduced to whom, and by whom, for in your world you cannot simply walk up and speak to a stranger, however charming. There must be a proper introduction, performed by the proper person, or the whole thing is improper. You learn that the wrong acquaintance can taint you, that to be seen too often with a fast set, or a family in decline, or anyone touched by scandal, is to risk a little of their dust settling on you. Your mother manages all of this, whom you know, whom you may know, whom you must on no account be seen to know, like a chess player thinking 6 moves ahead, and you are the most valuable piece on her board, and the least free. And then, as the day tips toward evening, the whole exhausting business of dressing begins again, for the morning's white gown will not do for dinner, and the dinner gown will not do for the ball, and a girl in the full swing of the season may change her clothes 4 or 5 times in a single day, each costume governed by its own iron code of what is correct for the hour. So back you go to your room, and off comes the afternoon dress, and your maid laces you afresh and assembles you again, this time in the gown chosen for the evening, richer, more elaborate, the jewels a little finer now that the candlelight will be kind to them. Your hair is taken down and rebuilt into something grander. The whole patient sculpture of you is dismantled and made anew, for the 2nd or 3rd time today, and you stand through all of it, arms slightly raised, thinking of nothing, because thinking is not required of you here. If there is a grand dinner before the ball, and in the great houses there often is, then a fresh ordeal of etiquette awaits, more precise and more pitiless than anything in the ballroom. For the formal Victorian dinner is a fortress of rules. There is the matter of precedence, the strict, unbending order in which the company goes into dinner, each lady on the arm of the gentleman assigned to her by rank, the whole procession arranged with the care of a coronation, so that a duke's daughter does not find herself behind a baronet's wife, and the table seethes with quiet calculation about who outranks whom. You will be taken in by whichever gentleman the hostess has decided, and seated where she has decided, and you will make pleasant conversation with the man on your right through one course, and turn, the whole table turning together, as if on a hidden signal, to the man on your left for the next. And before you stretches the battlefield of the table itself, the bewildering rows of silver, a different fork, a different knife, a different spoon for every one of the many courses, laid out in their precise order, and woe betide the girl who reaches for the wrong one. You have been drilled in all of it. You know which glass is which, how to manage the strange dishes, how to eat a difficult fruit with a knife and fork and never your fingers, how to keep up a flow of light, charming talk while navigating a meal designed, it sometimes seems, specifically to trip you up. One wrong move, a wrong fork, a too eager appetite, a clumsy remark, a laugh a shade too loud, and it will be noted and remembered and quietly told. And when the long dinner at last winds down, there comes one of the strangest customs of all, the moment when the hostess catches the eye of the senior lady, and rises, and all the women rise with her, and withdraw from the room, leaving the men behind. The ladies retire to the drawing-room, to coffee and quiet talk, while the gentlemen remain at the table with their wine and their cigars and their franker conversation, the talk of politics and business, and whatever men say when no women are present. It is a small ritual that tells you everything about your place, even here, in your own evening, at the height of your glittering moment. There are rooms you must leave, conversations you are not part of, a world of men's real business that closes its doors gently in your face. And in the drawing-room, among the women, the evening's true intelligence is exchanged, who is courting whom, whose match is nearly settled, whose daughter disappointed, whose fortune is not what it was, the soft, ceaseless murmur of the marriage market, conducted by its true managers, while the men drink port next door believing themselves in charge. Later still, when the men rejoin you, may come the music, for entertainment, in your world, is something you provide, not something you pay strangers to perform. A young lady is expected to be ready, if asked, to sit at the piano and play, or to sing, for the company. And here is one more of those exquisite little traps your whole education has set for you. You must play well enough to be charming, to show that you possess the proper accomplishments, but not so well, not with such real skill or feeling, that you seem to have taken it too seriously, for a woman who is truly, professionally good at something is faintly unsettling, a little outside her proper sphere. You must be talented in a way that costs nothing and threatens no one. So you play your pretty piece, neither too boldly nor too timidly, and you are praised, and you blush, and you sit down again, having performed not really music at all but one more proof that you are exactly the sort of decorative, agreeable creature a man might wish to install in his drawing-room for life. By the time you fall into bed at the end of a season day, late, always late, your feet ruined, your face aching from the smiling, your head full of names and slights and half-promising glances, you are more tired than any housemaid, and you have, by the standards of the working world, done absolutely nothing. You have danced. You have ridden in a park. You have left some cards. You have made conversation about the weather with perhaps 40 people. And every single one of those nothings was a small, deadly serious act of warfare, because your whole future, your entire worth, the success or failure of years of effort and oceans of money, depends on whether, out of all this glittering nothing, a suitable man can be made to propose before your bloom begins to fade. And suppose it works. Suppose, out of all the balls, and the cards, and the careful smiling, a gentleman does begin to single you out, to seek your company, to call at the house, to ride beside your carriage in the park. Even then, do not imagine that anything so simple as you and he deciding to marry is about to happen, because courtship, too, is a ritual conducted largely over your head. A serious suitor does not, in the first instance, pour out his heart to you. He speaks to your father. The real negotiation, the one that decides your fate, happens between the men and between the families, in quiet rooms you are not invited into, and it is largely about money. The marriage settlement must be arranged, what your father will provide, what the gentleman's family will guarantee, how you will be provided for if he dies, what becomes of any fortune you bring. Lawyers are involved. Documents are drawn. Your future is costed and contracted with the care of a treaty between nations, and only when the men are satisfied does the matter come properly to you, often as something very close to a settled fact. You may be fond of him. You may even, with luck, love him. But the machine does not run on love, and everyone knows it, and the kindest thing the machine can do is to deliver you a husband you can learn to be happy with. Many girls were not so lucky. You are expected to be grateful either way. And who, exactly, might this husband be, this stranger your whole life has been pointed toward? That, too, is mostly out of your hands. He might be young and pleasant, and near your own age, and you might count yourself fortunate. But he might just as easily be decades older than you, a widower seeking a fresh young wife to brighten his declining years and perhaps give him an heir. The marriage of a girl of 18 to a man of 50 raised few eyebrows, if the rank and money were right. However, it might have raised your own. He might be cold, or dull, or already worn down by his own troubles. He might gamble, or drink, or have habits no one will warn you of until it is far too late to matter. He might be perfectly kind and simply a stranger, a man you have spoken to for a grand total of a few carefully chaperoned hours. into whose keeping you will nonetheless be handed for the whole of the rest of your life, to live in his house, bear his children, and be bound to him by a law that, once the knot is tied, offers you almost no way out, whatever he turns out to be. You are gambling your entire future on a few dances and a handful of supervised conversations, reading a man's whole character from his manners at a ball, and praying you have read him right. Some girls guessed well and found contentment, even love. Some guessed badly and paid for it across 40 silent years. And you will not truly know which you have done until the music stops and the guests go home and the door of your new life closes quietly behind you. And running through every hour of all of this is the bewildering, unwritten code of etiquette, 1,000 tiny rules, each one a little trap, that you must obey without ever appearing to think about them. There is a language to the fan you carry, or there is said to be, a flutter, a position, a touch to the cheek, each supposedly carrying a message to a watching admirer, though half its meanings are invented, and the danger of an accidental signal is real enough. There is the matter of gloves, which a lady scarcely removes in public, so that to be caught barehanded is a small exposure. There is the grammar of the calling card, with its turned-down corners each meaning a different thing, a card to congratulate, a card to condole, a card that says you called in person, a card that says farewell before a journey, a whole silent correspondence conducted in folded cardboard. There are the laws of mourning, most rigid of all, dictating exactly how long you must wear black for which relative, then gray, then half-mourning mauve, the very depth of your sorrow legislated by how recently and how closely someone died. There are rules for whom you may greet in the street and whom you must pretend not to see, rules for how low to bow and to whom, rules for which subjects may be spoken of before unmarried girls, and which must wait until they have left the room. None of it is written down anywhere you can study. You are simply expected to know it, all of it, perfectly, and every slip, every wrong fork and mistimed call and overwarm greeting, is silently recorded in the great invisible ledger that the world keeps on every girl, and consulted, later, when it decides what you are worth. And it costs you, this life, not only in nerves and freedom, but in your very body. The corset that gives you your fashionable shape, laced a little tighter each season as the waist grows smaller in the eye of fashion, presses on everything a body needs to do its work. You cannot draw a full breath. You cannot bend properly. You cannot eat a real meal. Small wonder that the well-bred young lady of your century is forever feeling faint, forever needing to sit, forever reaching for the little bottle of smelling salts. Small wonder that great houses kept a fainting couch in the ladies' withdrawing room, a place for overlaced girls to be half revived. What looks, in the paintings, like delicate, romantic fragility is very often just a young woman slowly suffocating in the name of beauty. And you bear it without complaint, because complaint is unladylike, and because you have been taught since the nursery that to suffer prettily and in silence is simply part of what it means to be a woman of your station. The cage is gilded, yes, but some of its bars are laced around your own ribs. Because that is the fear, isn't it, underneath the silk? That is the cold thing at the bottom of the lovely white dress. The fear of the failed season. The fear of doing it all. The curtsey, the balls, the cards, the smiling, and going home in the autumn with no engagement, no proposal, nothing, and having to do it all again next year, a little less fresh, a little more anxious, your mother a little more frightened. And then again. And then, if the worst comes, becoming that most pitted of creatures, the spinster, the unmarried woman of a certain age, with no husband and no home of her own, dependent forever on her father and then her brother, a permanent guest in other people's lives, the maiden aunt in the spare room, kindly tolerated, quietly diminished, valued chiefly for her usefulness with other women's children. In a world that has trained you for exactly one role, and given you no way to live outside it, to fail to marry is not merely to be lonely. It is to be left gently, without a place. And every debutante knows it. It is the shadow under every chandelier. And consider, too, what actually waits at the end of this glittering chase, the prize you are all competing for, the thing a successful season delivers you into. Marriage. The wedding itself will be a triumph. The white gown, the great church, the breakfast after, your mother at last able to breathe. But the morning after the wedding, you step through a door into a life you have been told almost nothing about. For here is one of the quietest cruelties of your upbringing. A well-bred girl is kept in near total ignorance of the intimate facts of marriage, of what a wife's body is for in the eyes of her age. Innocence is prized so highly that knowledge itself is thought a kind of stain, and so a great many brides go to their wedding night frightened and bewildered, having been told nothing, or worse, told just enough to dread it. You will be expected to know nothing and then, overnight, to know your duty. It is a strange and lonely way to begin the central relationship of your life. And then you become a wife, which means you become the mistress of a household, responsible for the servants, the menus, the accounts, the running of a great machine you were never actually taught to run, only to decorate. And almost at once, you will be expected to do the one thing that truly secures your place, to produce children, and above all a son and heir. Which brings you to the greatest danger of all, the one that hides beneath all the silk and ceremony. Childbirth, in your century, is genuinely perilous. There is little that we would recognize as medicine, no understanding yet of the infections that kill so many new mothers, no reliable way to save a birth gone wrong. A frightening number of women, rich and poor alike, the duchess and the housemaid together, simply do not survive bringing a child into the world, or are broken by it, or buried with the infant beside them. The lovely girl in the white debutante's gown, dancing under the candles, is being prepared, at the end of it all, for a marriage bed that is also, statistically, one of the most dangerous places she will ever lie. No one says this at the ball, of course, but it is the unspoken stakes beneath the whole pretty game. And so here you are, in your golden cage, and it is gold, make no mistake. This is a life of unimaginable privilege, of silk and candlelight and more comfort than almost anyone alive in your century will ever know. You are warm where others freeze, fed where others starve, fussed over where others are worked to the bone. And yet it is a cage all the same, and you feel its bars on nights like this. You cannot choose your own days. You cannot walk down a street alone. You cannot say what you truly think. You cannot earn a penny or own a thing or steer your own life by so much as an inch. Your one task, the only one you have ever been given, is to be charming enough, and pretty enough, and good enough, to persuade a man to take you off your father's hands, and then to do it all over again on the other side of the marriage, as a wife. The most envied girl in England, dressed in white, dancing under 1,000 candles. And underneath it, just a young woman, very tired, hoping someone kind will choose her, trying not to think too hard about a future she was never allowed to hold the reins of. And what of your own heart in all of this? It is the question your world is least interested in, and yet it does not stop beating just because no one asks. Somewhere beneath the white gown and the practiced smile, you are a young woman like any other in any age, full of curiosity, of longing, of opinions you are not permitted to voice, of dreams that have nowhere to go. Perhaps you would have liked to learn something properly, to study, to use that quick mind for more than charming arithmetic across a fan. Perhaps there is a young man you actually like, who has neither title nor fortune, and so might as well live on the moon for all the good it will do you. Perhaps you simply long now and then to walk down a street alone, to be unwatched for an hour, to say one true and unguarded thing. These wishes are not encouraged. They are not even acknowledged. You are taught, gently and relentlessly, to want what you are supposed to want: a good match, a fine house, a secure place, and to fold the rest of yourself away so neatly that in time you may almost forget it was ever there. Most girls learn the lesson. They had to. The cost of not learning it was ruin. And so they became the serene, accomplished, agreeable wives the system required, carrying whatever they had quietly buried into a respectable middle age, and the world called this happiness and moved on. But not all of them folded so neatly. Here and there, a girl looked at the cage and refused it, eloped with the wrong man, or declined the right one, or simply would not play, and bore the consequences, which could be severe. And a rare few, as we are about to see, took the very rules that were meant to contain them, and turned them into something else entirely: a stage, a fortune, a weapon, a cause. They are the exceptions, and we remember them precisely because they were exceptions. For every Jennie or Lillie who dazzled or escaped, there were 10,000 whose names we will never know, who curtsied and married and vanished quietly into the long, unrecorded patience of women's lives. Tonight we light a candle for the famous ones. But let us spare a thought, too, for the others, the wallflowers and the dutiful daughters, and the ones who simply did as they were told, because they were every bit as real, and every bit as brave, in their own unsung way. So that is a day, a season, in the life of a Victorian debutante. And the truth is, you wouldn't last one. Not the waiting, not the curtsey, not the corset, not the smiling through gritted teeth, not the slow terror of the blank dance card and the fading summer. We look back at those girls in their lovely white gowns, and we see only the beauty of it. We forget that each one was a real young woman, full of hopes. She was not allowed to speak, walking a tightrope she did not choose, in shoes that pinched, smiling for her life. Now let the candlelight blur a little, and let's leave the ballroom behind. Because some of those young women, a rare, remarkable few, stepped onto that stage and did far more than survive it. They dazzled. They schemed. They broke the rules and rewrote them. And their stories are the ones we'll drift through now, slowly, in the warm dark, as you let yourself grow heavy. 3 real women born into this glittering, gilded cage, and what they did once the doors swung open. Long before she was Lady Randolph Churchill, before she was the mother of a prime minister, before half of London was a little in love with her and the other half a little afraid, she was simply Jennie Jerome, an American girl with American money and an American boldness, who sailed across an ocean and conquered the most snobbish society on earth almost by accident, simply by being more alive than everyone in the room. She was born in Brooklyn in the 1850s into the brand new, freshly minted world of American wealth. Her father, Leonard Jerome, was a flamboyant Wall Street speculator, a man who made fortunes and lost them and made them again, who loved horses and opera and beautiful women, who built an actual private theater into his New York mansion, and was not at all the sort of respectable, restrained gentleman that English society approved of. And Jennie adored him. From her father she got her dark, flashing eyes, her love of music, her appetite for risk, and a confidence that English girls, raised to be modest and quiet and small, simply did not have. There has long been a rumor, never proven, that Jennie had distant Iroquois ancestry, and she never bothered to deny it. She rather liked the air of the exotic. She was, from the start, a girl who took up space, and in the world she was about to enter, a woman who took up space was a thrilling and slightly dangerous thing. When the Jerome fortunes wobbled, as they periodically did, Jennie's mother did what ambitious American mothers of the age increasingly did. She took her daughters to Europe. Because Europe, and England above all, had something America could not yet sell: old titles, old names, old aristocracy, gone quietly short of cash. And America had something England suddenly, desperately needed: new money, oceans of it. And so was born one of the great marriage markets of the age, the trade that would later be called the dollar princesses. American heiresses exchanged for British titles, new gold poured into old, leaking estates, to the satisfaction of the scheming mothers on both shores. Jennie was about to become one of the first, and one of the most spectacular. It happened at Cowes, the yachting regatta, in the summer of 1873. Jennie, 19 and dazzling, was introduced to a young English aristocrat named Lord Randolph Churchill, second son of the Duke of Marlborough, clever, ambitious, intense, and rather odd. They danced, they talked, and by all accounts, by the end of that evening, both of them were quite sure. 3 days. It took 3 days for Lord Randolph to decide he would marry her, a speed that scandalized everyone and delighted the two of them enormously. This was not the slow, calculated courtship the rules demanded. This was something closer to a collision. And both families were horrified. The Duke of Marlborough did not want an American, and worse, an American whose father's fortune came and went like the tide. Leonard Jerome did not love the idea of handing his beloved daughter to a chilly English family who plainly looked down on him. There were months of difficult negotiation, much of it not about love at all, but about money, the marriage settlement, the dowry, who would pay for what, the cold machinery grinding away beneath the romance, exactly as it did for every debutante in every ballroom. The negotiation that followed was long, and bitter, and entirely characteristic of the world we have spent tonight inside, for beneath the talk of a love so sudden it scandalized 2 continents, the real obstacle was, as ever, the settlement. The Duke wanted to know precisely what the American would bring. Leonard Jerome, proud and stung by the English condescension, was reluctant to simply hand his daughter's fortune over to be absorbed by her husband's family in the usual way, and dug in to protect something for Jennie herself. Letters crossed the Atlantic for months, the lawyers wrangling over sums and guarantees, while the 2 young people fretted and fumed and threatened, in the manner of the young, to do something rash. It is a detail worth holding on to, that even this, the most romantic match of its decade, the lightning-strike love affair that everyone gossiped about, still had to pass, like every other marriage in this story, through the cold counting-house of the settlement before it could reach the altar. Love lit the fire. Money decided whether it would be allowed to burn. But Randolph and Jennie held firm, and at last they wore everyone down, and in the spring of 1874 they were married at the British Embassy in Paris. She arrived, then, a bride of 20, into one of the greatest houses in England, Blenheim Palace, that vast Baroque monument the nation had given the Churchill's ancestor for winning a war, a house so enormous, and so cold, and so weighed down with history that it could make a confident woman feel like a trespasser. The Duke and Duchess, her new in-laws, were correct and chilly and unmistakably unconvinced by their American acquisition. The English aristocracy, in those first months, watched her the way a closed society always watches a stranger who is married in, waiting, half hoping, for her to put a foot wrong, to reveal herself as loud, or vulgar, or simply not one of them. A lesser woman might have shrunk under that cool, appraising gaze. Jennie, characteristically, did the opposite. She studied them, learned their codes faster than they expected, and then beat them at their own game, becoming more dazzling, more sought after, more central to the fashionable world than the very people who had doubted her. Within a few short years, the question was no longer whether English society would accept Jennie Churchill. It was whether you were fashionable enough to be invited to her parties. Jennie Jerome of Brooklyn was now Lady Randolph Churchill of Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest houses in all of England. And then the real performance began, because being accepted by English society was a far harder thing than catching an English lord. The aristocracy could be brutal to an outsider, and a brash American with a famous laugh and too much confidence might have been frozen out entirely. But Jennie did not freeze. She conquered. She was beautiful, yes, with those extraordinary dark eyes, but more than that she was magnetic, quick, witty, musical, a gifted pianist who could hold a room, a brilliant talker who actually said things, fearless in exactly the way English girls were trained not to be. Where a debutante was taught to never outshine a man, Jennie outshone everyone and made them grateful for it. Men were enchanted. Women, after their initial suspicion, mostly surrendered. And before long she had climbed to the very summit of society, into the dazzling, fashionable circle that surrounded the Prince of Wales himself, the future King Edward, who collected charming, beautiful, clever people the way other men collected paintings, and who found Jennie Churchill very charming indeed. That same year, 1874, in a draughty room at Blenheim, Jennie gave birth, early, suddenly, to a son. They named him Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. And though no one in that room could possibly have known it, the brash American girl had just brought into the world the man who would one day lead Britain through its darkest and finest hour. But that is a story for another century. For now, he was simply a baby, handed off, as aristocratic babies always were, to a nanny and a nursery. For Jennie, like every woman of her class, was not expected to raise her own children with her own hands. She loved her sons in her way, but hers was the love of a glamorous, distant comet, swooping in brilliantly and swooping out again. Young Winston would later write of his mother with an ache that never quite healed, that he loved her dearly, but at a distance, that she shone for him like the evening star, beautiful and brilliant and far away. For these were the glittering years, and Jennie lived them at full speed. She was at the center of everything, the balls, the country house parties, the races, the endless social whirl of the Marlborough House set, that fast, fashionable, pleasure-loving world around the prince. And it was a world, let us be honest in the dark, of considerable discretion when it came to marriage. Among the grand set, once a wife had done her duty and produced her heirs, a certain quiet freedom was understood on both sides, so long as appearances were kept. And Jennie, beautiful and vivid and married to a man increasingly consumed by his own troubles, was the subject of a great deal of admiring attention, and, it was widely whispered, returned a good deal of it. She was linked, over the years, to some of the most powerful men in Europe, and she wore the gossip lightly, as a beautiful woman who has decided not to be ashamed often can. But the glitter, as it always does in these stories, began to dim. Lord Randolph's life took a meteoric and then a tragic turn. He was, for a few brilliant years, one of the most exciting politicians in Britain, sharp, daring, a dazzling speaker who rose with astonishing speed to become Chancellor of the Exchequer, one of the highest offices in the land, with the whole country talking about him as a future Prime Minister. And then, in a fit of arrogance, he gambled his career on a single reckless resignation, expecting to be begged back, and he was not begged back. He had misjudged it entirely. His rise ended as suddenly as it had begun, and from that height he started a long, terrible fall. For Randolph was a sick man, growing sicker, his health and his mind both failing him by slow, cruel degrees over years. Jennie watched the brilliant, difficult man she had married in 3 dizzy days deteriorate before her eyes, and she nursed him with real loyalty as he declined, traveling the world with him in a last desperate search for a cure that did not exist, until he died in 1895, not yet 46, a wreck of the man he had been. Jennie was a widow at 40, still beautiful, still magnetic, still very much alive, and now, for the first time, somewhat on her own. And here the American in her showed again, because she did not retreat into quiet widowhood, as the rules suggested she should. She launched a literary magazine, an ambitious and elegant thing, and ran it herself. She threw herself into her son's careers, and especially into Winston's, becoming his fierce, tireless champion, pulling every string in her vast web of connections, opening doors, writing letters, working the great network of powerful friends she had spent a lifetime charming, to launch her brilliant, headstrong boy into the world. The distant evening star became, in his manhood, his most devoted ally. Winston himself said that in his early career she was less a mother than a wonderful, loyal friend who fought for him with everything she had. It is worth lingering, in the warm dark, on just how thoroughly Jennie refused the mold. She wore her American difference like a jewel rather than hiding it. She had, famously, a small tattoo, a thin serpent coiled around her wrist, which she could cover with a bracelet when propriety demanded and reveal when it amused her to shock. In an age when an aristocratic Englishwoman was meant to be pale, restrained, and faintly bloodless, Jennie was vivid, sun-warm, quick to laugh, quicker to argue, and entirely unafraid to be the most interesting person in any drawing-room. Her dinner parties became legendary not merely for their guest lists, but for their conversation, because Jennie actually talked about politics, about books, about the world, with men who were used to women murmuring agreeably about the weather. She made being clever fashionable, at least for herself, which is the hardest trick of all. And she did it while raising, at arm's length and yet with fierce pride, 2 sons in whom she had invested every hope. When her husband's politics were at their height, she had thrown herself into them body and soul, becoming one of the most effective political hostesses of the age. For in a world where women could not vote or stand for office, the drawing-room was the one chamber of power a clever woman could command. She charmed the men who made decisions, brokered the introductions that mattered, smoothed the quarrels, flattered the vain, and worked Randolph's cause through the soft channels that ran quietly beneath the hard machinery of Parliament. Some said she was the best campaigner in the family. And when years later, she turned that same formidable energy to launching Winston, she did it with the seasoned skill of a woman who had spent her whole life learning, against every rule, how a person with no official power could still move the world by knowing exactly the right people and exactly how to enchant them. Nor did she sit still as a grieving widow. When Britain went to war in South Africa at the turn of the century, Jennie, by then in her 40s and supposedly past her prime, organized and helped to fund an American-sponsored hospital ship, the Maine, to carry medical aid to the wounded, and she sailed out with it herself, throwing her name, her connections, and her boundless energy behind a real and difficult enterprise. She wrote, too, memoirs, articles, even plays that were actually staged, at a time when a lady scribbling for publication still raised eyebrows. The girl from Brooklyn never stopped reinventing what a woman of her position was allowed to be. And she fell in love again, repeatedly, and somewhat scandalously, with younger men. She married a second time, to a man some 20 years her junior, near the age of her own son. The marriage caused a stir and did not last. Years later, in her 60s, she married a third time, to a man younger still. Society clucked and gossiped and shook its head. Jennie did not much care. She had decided, long ago, to live as fully and as boldly as her own appetite for life demanded, and she was not about to stop now to satisfy people who had never quite forgiven her for being more vivid than they were. She died in 1921, at 67, after a fall on a staircase led to an infection that took her life. And she died, fittingly, in a pair of new high-heeled shoes, for she had been vain and lively and game to the very end. The girl from Brooklyn, who had come to England as an outsider and a curiosity, died a great lady of the realm, the mother of a man who would become one of the most important figures of the 20th century, having lived more, loved more, dared more, and laughed more than almost any woman of her cautious, corseted age. And here is the thing to carry with you as you grow drowsy. Jennie Jerome played the same game as every trembling debutante in every white gown: the marriage market, the dowry, the family negotiations, the cold arithmetic beneath the romance. She was, in the end, a dollar princess, traded across an ocean, money for a name. But she refused to be merely the goods. She took the cage they built for her, and she lived inside it as though it were a stage, and she dazzled, and she chose, and she made her own way through a world that meant to make all her choices for her. Think, for a moment, of the distance she traveled, not across the ocean, though that was real enough, but across the invisible borders of what a woman of her time was permitted to be. She began as a commodity in the oldest trade there is, a beautiful girl with money behind her, shipped to a market that wanted her father's gold and would tolerate her foreignness as the price of it. That is how the world first valued her, as a sum attached to a face. And by the end, she had made herself into something the ledger had no column for, a power in her own right, a maker of careers and a shaper of a great man, a woman whose friendship presidents and princes sought, whose name still echoes faintly through the story of the 20th century because she launched into it the son she loved at a brilliant, painful distance. The marriage market got its transaction. But the woman it bought refused, all her life, to behave like a thing that had been bought. She did not last a day as a quiet, obedient English lady. She did something far harder, and far more interesting. She became entirely, unrepentantly herself. long before she was the most famous woman in England, before her face was printed on postcards sold in their thousands, before princes and painters and the whole of London lost their heads over her. She was simply Lillie, Emily Charlotte Le Breton, a clergyman's daughter from a small island in the sea, with no money, no title, no connections, and nothing in the world to her name but a face that would change her life completely. She was born on the island of Jersey in the 1850s, the only daughter among a crowd of brothers, the child of the Dean of Jersey, a respectable, modest, clerical household, comfortable but far from rich, and a very long way from the glittering ballrooms of London. She grew up half wild among her brothers, riding, swimming in the cold sea, climbing where she shouldn't, with a freedom most well-bred girls were never allowed. And she grew up beautiful, strikingly, unusually beautiful, with a fresh, healthy, vivid loveliness quite unlike the pale, delicate ideal of the age. But beauty alone, on a small island, married to no fortune, is a key without a lock. Lillie wanted more than Jersey could offer. She wanted the wide world. And like so many girls of her time, she understood that the only door out was marriage. So she married a man named Edward Langtry, a widower with a yacht and what looked like money, which to a girl longing to escape an island seemed like the whole of the answer. It was not. The money was thinner than it appeared, the man duller, and the marriage, almost from the start, a disappointment. But it did one crucial thing. It carried her off Jersey and, eventually, to London. And in London, in the spring of her young womanhood, with little money and a husband she had already half outgrown, Lillie Langtry was about to do something that should have been impossible. With no rank, no fortune, and no connections at all, she was about to conquer society armed with nothing but a black dress and a face. Her first taste of London was not triumph, but a kind of grey disappointment. She and Edward took modest lodgings. They knew almost no one who mattered. The great world she had dreamed of from her island spun on without the slightest awareness that she existed. She was a nobody, a provincial young wife with a tedious husband, a thin purse, and no foothold whatever in society. She might easily have sunk into exactly the obscure, frustrated, ordinary life she had married to escape, one of the countless bright women the age quietly wasted. For a while, it must have looked as though that was precisely what would happen. And then a single evening, a single invitation, a single plain black dress, changed everything, and that abruptness, that overnight transformation from invisible to unforgettable, is the part of her story that still seems almost too neat to be true. The story of how it happened is almost absurdly simple, and that is what makes it so dazzling. She was taken, one evening, to a party, a small affair, where she knew almost no one. She was in mourning for a brother, and so she wore a plain black gown, the only good one she had, with no jewels, her hair simply dressed, no ornament of any kind. And in a room full of women in silk and diamonds, this unknown girl in stark, simple black, with that extraordinary face and that fresh, glowing skin, stopped the room. People asked who she was. Artists asked to paint her. Within days, the whole of fashionable London was talking about the beautiful unknown, the girl from Jersey, the new face. They began to call her the Jersey Lillie. And the painters, the great painters of the age, did paint her, again and again, and those paintings were exhibited, and crowds gathered before them, and her image began to spread. The artists, in particular, could not leave her alone, and it was they who truly built the legend. The greatest painters of the day begged her to sit for them. One of the most celebrated pictures of her hung in the Royal Academy's annual exhibition, and drew such crowds that a rope had to be put up to hold the public back from the image of this unknown girl. She became the living muse of the fashionable aesthetic movement, that cult of beauty for its own sake then sweeping artistic London. And among the young men who worshipped at the altar of her loveliness was a brilliant, outrageous, not yet famous Irishman named Oscar Wilde, who attached himself to her with theatrical devotion, wrote poems to her, was said to have once slept on her doorstep, and helped, with his genius for publicity, to fan her fame into a blaze. To be the woman that Wilde adored and the painters fought to capture was to become not merely admired but iconic, a symbol, a face that stood for beauty itself in the imagination of a whole society. And then came the thing that no clever marriage and no enormous dowry could ever quite buy. Photographs of her, for this was the dawn of the photographic age, were printed and sold publicly, by the thousand, in shop windows across the country. Ordinary people, who would never see the inside of a ballroom, bought postcards of Lillie Langtry's face, and pinned them up and passed them around. She became, in a sense the world had barely seen before her, a celebrity, famous simply for being beautiful, famous to people who had never met her and never would. She was arguably one of the very first of a kind of person we now know all too well, the professional beauty, the face that the public adores. And all of it had begun with a poor girl in a borrowed-looking black dress, with nothing to sell but how she looked. Her fame brought her to the very top of society, and at the top of society, in those years, was the Prince of Wales, Bertie, the future King Edward, the pleasure-loving, charming, endlessly indulgent heir to the throne, who adored beautiful women above almost all things on earth. They were introduced, and Lillie Langtry became, for several years, the prince's mistress, his acknowledged favorite, the reigning beauty on the arm of the future king. It is a measure of how strange and how layered her world was that this was, in its way, a kind of triumph. She was paraded, half openly, in the highest circles. Even her husband was, by the unspoken rules of that discreet and hypocritical society, expected to look the other way and be glad of the doors that opened. The clergyman's daughter from Jersey now moved among kings. But a position built entirely on beauty and royal favor is a position built on sand, and the tide always comes in. Royal favor, by its nature, does not last forever. There is always a new beauty, a new face, a new spring, and slowly, inevitably, the prince's attention drifted elsewhere. Her marriage, meanwhile, had collapsed into ruin and debt. Edward Langtry's money was gone, and gone with it the respectable cover their union had provided. And there was more, for Lillie, in these years, had a daughter, a child she would for a long time pass off, quietly, as a niece, the father a matter of careful silence and persistent rumor. Suddenly the most famous beauty in England found herself where she had begun, without money, and now without the protection of royal favor or a functioning marriage, and with a child to provide for. The fairy tale had run out. The postcards still sold. But postcards do not pay the bills. And here is where Lillie Langtry becomes truly remarkable, because most women in her position, in her century, would have sunk quietly out of sight, ruined and pitted. Lillie refused. She looked at the one asset she had, her fame, that strange new currency she had half invented, and she decided to do something almost unthinkable for a woman who had moved in royal circles. She decided to earn her own living. She would go on the stage. She would become an actress. Now, you must understand what that meant. In the rigid moral world of the Victorian aristocracy, the stage was not respectable. An actress was regarded as barely a step above a fallen woman. For a lady, even a tarnished one, to tread the boards for money was to step deliberately outside the bounds of polite society. But Lillie had already lived outside the rules, and she had a clearer eye than almost anyone for where the real power lay. And so she went on stage, and she drew enormous crowds, because of course she did. All those thousands who had bought her photograph now flocked to see the famous Jersey Lillie in the flesh. She was not, at first, a great actress, but she learned. She worked. She got better. And she became something far rarer than a great actress, a great businesswoman. She formed her own theatrical company. She toured America, again and again, where her fame burned even brighter, crossing the ocean not as a dollar princess being sold into a title, but as a star, selling tickets, banking her own profits, the master of her own enterprise. And it should be said that she did not merely trade on her face forever. She actually became good. The early performances leaned on her fame and her beauty, and the critics were not always kind, sniffing that the famous Mrs. Langtry was a celebrity playing at being an actress. But Lillie worked, with the same cold determination she brought to everything, studying her craft, taking on harder roles, learning the stage as a trade rather than a lark, until in time she had built a genuine career and a real reputation as a player and a manager of players. There is a lesson in that worth carrying off to sleep, that the beauty opened the door, but it was the work, the unglamorous, unfeminine, unrelenting work, that built the house beyond it. And here is a grace note to the whole strange tale. Even after the romance with the Prince of Wales cooled, even after she had fallen from royal favor and gone out to earn her bread on the stage, he remained, quietly, her friend. He attended her performances. He used his enormous influence now and then on her behalf. In a world that could be savage to a fallen woman, the man who had raised her up did not, in the end, cast her down, and that odd, enduring kindness between them, long after the passion was gone, says something gentler about that hard society than most of its rules ever did. And she was shrewd with the money. The girl who had married for an escape and watched two men's fortunes fail her now built one of her own, with her own hands and her own name. She invested. She bought property in America. She became, of all things, a celebrated owner of racehorses, running her horses under an assumed name so that she could compete in a world that did not welcome women, and winning, including some of the great races of the turf. The clergyman's daughter who had owned nothing now owned land, and horses, and her own time, and herself. She had taken the only thing the world had ever valued in her, her beauty, and she had used it, with cold intelligence, as the seed capital for a freedom almost no woman of her age achieved, financial independence, won by her own work. America, in particular, adored her, and she returned the affection in the only language she fully trusted, business. She crossed the Atlantic again and again on long, triumphant theatrical tours, and she traveled them in style that startled even the Americans. A private railway carriage, fitted out and named the Lillie, a rolling palace of silk and polished wood that carried her across a continent like a queen on wheels. The crowds came in their thousands, in cities that had never seen a real London beauty, to look at the famous face in the flesh, and Lillie counted the receipts herself and banked the profits in her own name. She became an American citizen for a time, the better to manage her affairs and, some said, to free herself from an inconvenient marriage. She bought land in California and planted a vineyard, turning the admiration of strangers into acres and vines and wine that bore her name. Out in the harsh country of West Texas, a rough old frontier judge named Roy Bean became so besotted with her image that he named his saloon, and effectively his whole dusty town, in her honor, the Jersey Lily, and wrote to her, and dreamed of her visit. She did, in the end, arrive, just after the strange old man had died, to find a town that had loved her without ever once meeting her. That was the peculiar new power she wielded, to be adored, profitably, by multitudes of people she would never know. And she loved the horses. With her theatrical fortune, she built a serious racing stable, and because the turf was a man's domain that did not welcome a woman owner, she simply registered her horses under a man's name and raced them anyway, and won, including victories in some of the great races of the English calendar, standing in the winner's circle as the owner of champions in a sport that had never meant to let her in at all. She lived long, and she lived large. She had her loves, her scandals, her triumphs, and her deaths and her comebacks. In time, after her first husband's death, she married again, to a man much younger than herself, and gained at last a title of her own, Lady de Bathe, so that the professional beauty, the actress, the racehorse owner, the woman polite society had so often tooted over, ended her days, with a certain irony, as a titled lady after all. She settled finally in the south of France, in the sun, and died there in 1929, in her 70s, having outlived the prince who loved her, the world that made her, and very nearly the entire century she had so spectacularly adorned. So as you lie there, drowsy now, let her stories settle over you. Lillie Langtry began with nothing, no money, no name, no connections, in a world where a woman without those things was meant to remain quietly invisible. She had only a face, and the rules of her age said that a face was a thing for men to admire and to own. Lillie looked at those same rules, and saw something else entirely. She saw that her face was an asset, and she alone decided what to do with it. She traded admiration for fame, and fame for opportunity, and opportunity, at last, for the one thing her century almost never allowed a woman to have, a life that was genuinely, defiantly her own. She would not have lasted a day as a meek, obedient wife on a quiet island. So she became something the world had no name for yet, and made the world learn it. Long before she changed the law of England, before she forced a nation of men to look at the quiet injustice they had built and lived inside without ever questioning it, she was simply Caroline Sheridan, one of 3 famously beautiful sisters, born into a great name and very little money, with a sharp mind, a quick wit, and a gift with words she had inherited along with her looks. And her story is the darkest of our 3 tonight, and in some ways the most important, because Caroline lived out, in full, the nightmare that lay coiled beneath every debutante's lovely white dress. And then she did something almost no wrong woman of her age ever managed. She fought back in public, and she won. She was born in 1808, a granddaughter of Richard Brinsley Sheridan, the celebrated playwright and politician, so she came from brilliance, from theater and wit and parliament, from a family that shone in every drawing room but never quite had the fortune to match its fame. The 3 Sheridan sisters were renowned across society for their beauty, and beauty, as we have seen all night, was the great asset and the great currency of a girl with no money. They were known, half admiringly, as the 3 Graces, and they would all marry into the aristocracy, one of Caroline's sisters becoming a duchess, another marrying a lord, so that Caroline alone, the cleverest, drew the cruelest lot of the three. Their childhood had been one of brilliance without security. A famous, beloved grandfather whose wit still echoed through the theatres of London, a name that opened every door, and behind the dazzle, the constant, grinding anxiety of a family living on charm and credit rather than land and rents. Caroline grew up understanding, in her bones, the gap between how things looked and how they were, the smiling surface and the worried arithmetic beneath, and it gave her, along with her beauty, a watchful intelligence and a tongue that could cut. She was made to shine in drawing-rooms. She was made, though no one yet knew it, for something a great deal harder than shining. Caroline was clever, perhaps the cleverest of them, funny, charming, a natural writer who would, throughout her life, earn real admiration for her poetry and her prose. But cleverness was not what the marriage market priced. And Caroline, beautiful and witty and poor, was duly married off, at 19, to a man named George Norton. It was a disaster. Almost from the beginning, it was a disaster. George Norton was jealous, sullen, idle, and given to violence. He was, by Caroline's account and by much surrounding evidence, physically brutal to her, beating her, more than once, badly. He resented her brilliance and her social ease, the way she shone where he sulked, the way doors opened for her that stayed shut to him. And here is the first thing you must understand, the thing that turns a private misery into something larger. Under the law of England at that time, there was almost nothing she could do. A married woman, in the eyes of the law, did not fully exist as a separate person. The legal doctrine was called coverture, and under it a wife's legal identity was absorbed into her husband's. She could not own property in her own right. Anything she had became his. She could not sign a contract. She could not keep her own earnings. And there was no real escape. Divorce, in those years, was almost impossible to obtain, available in practice only to wealthy men, by a special and ruinously expensive act of Parliament, and effectively never to a woman. Caroline was trapped, by law, in a violent marriage, and the law offered her no door. What it could not take from her was her wit and her connections, and these she used. She turned the family's London house into a celebrated political salon, gathering the brilliant and the powerful around her, and she earned money, real money, with her pen, publishing poetry and prose that were genuinely admired. Those salon years are worth dwelling on, because they show what Caroline might have been in a kinder world. Her house became one of the liveliest gathering places in literary and political London. Poets, novelists, statesmen, editors, the brilliant talkers of the age, all drawn by her wit and her beauty and the genuine quality of her mind. She was a real writer, not a dabbling one. Her poetry sold, was reviewed with respect, was set beside the admired names of the day, and her earnings from her pen were substantial enough that they would later become a weapon in her husband's hands, for under the law even the money she made by her own talent was legally his to claim. Picture it, a woman of dazzling gifts, presiding over the cleverest room in London, courted by the powerful, earning a real income from her art, and legally, in the eyes of England, a kind of perpetual child, owning nothing, controlling nothing, the property of a sullen and violent man who could appear at any moment and take it all. The contradiction at the heart of her life was almost unbearable, and she felt every inch of it. Among the powerful men drawn into her circle was one of the greatest of the age, Lord Melbourne, the Whig statesman who would soon become Prime Minister, and who would become the trusted mentor and friend of the young Queen Victoria herself. Melbourne and Caroline became close friends. He was decades her senior. He visited often. They talked and corresponded and enjoyed one another's company in a way that was almost certainly an intimate friendship and quite possibly nothing more. But in Caroline's world, a married woman's reputation was a pane of glass, and her husband was about to pick up a stone. For George Norton saw, in his wife's famous friendship with the Prime Minister, not a humiliation but an opportunity. In 1836, in a stunning act of cynicism, he sued Lord Melbourne, taking him to court under an old legal action that allowed a husband to sue another man for, in effect, trespassing upon his wife, treating her as a piece of his property that had been damaged. He demanded an enormous sum in damages. The case was a sensation, splashed across every newspaper in the land. The Prime Minister of England dragged into court over his friendship with a beautiful married woman. It threatened to bring down the government. And Caroline, the woman at the center of it all, whose name and character were being torn apart in public day after day, was not even permitted to attend. She could not testify. She could not defend herself. She had no standing in a case that was entirely about her, because the law that absorbed her identity into her husband's left her, quite literally, with no voice in her own scandal. She could only read about her own ruin in the papers, like everyone else. For 9 days the courtroom became the most popular theater in London. The public packed the gallery. The newspapers printed every salacious detail. Cartoonists drew her. Strangers who had never met her debated her character over their breakfast as though they knew her soul. Servants were paraded to testify about letters and visits, and the arrangement of furniture, every innocent domestic fact twisted into evidence of guilt, and all of it splashed across the press for a nation to feast on. And through the whole grotesque carnival, the woman whose name and honor were being torn to shreds sat at home, silent, legally erased, permitted neither to speak in her own defense nor even to be present. Imagine the particular horror of it, to be the subject of every conversation in England, the villain of a national scandal, and to have no voice at all, no way to say so much as, "That is not true," because the law had decided that a wife was not a person who could stand up in a court and be heard. The jury, to their credit, saw through it. They threw the case out. Norton was awarded nothing. But the verdict, though it cleared Melbourne, did nothing to clear Caroline. Her reputation was in ruins, for in her world, to be talked about was to be guilty, and she had been talked about in every newspaper in England. And now George Norton, having failed to win his damages, reached for the one weapon the law still placed entirely in his hands, the cruelest weapon of all. He took her children. They had 3 young sons. And under English law as it then stood, the children of a marriage belonged, absolutely and exclusively, to the father. A mother had no legal right to them whatsoever, no right of custody, no right of access, no right even to see them, if the father forbade it. None. A father could remove his children from their mother entirely, hand them to relatives or strangers, and the mother had no recourse at law, however blameless she was, however cruel he was. And this is precisely what George Norton did. He took their sons away, hid them from her, moved them about, used them as instruments of punishment and leverage, and denied her even the sight of them. Caroline, who had done nothing the law could find against her, was simply, lawfully, severed from her own children. For a mother, it was a torture with no name and no remedy. and it broke something in her, and then, slowly, it forged something harder in its place. Because Caroline Norton did not weep quietly and submit, as her century expected a ruined woman to do. She got angry, a clear, cold, articulate anger, and she picked up the only weapon she had ever truly owned, the one her husband could not confiscate, her pen. If the law gave a mother no rights, then the law was wrong, and she would say so, loudly, in print, to the whole nation. She began to write, not poetry now, but argument. Fierce, brilliant, devastating pamphlets and public letters, laying out in plain, unanswerable language the monstrous position of a married woman under English law, that she could be beaten and not protected, slandered and not heard, robbed of her own earnings, and stripped of her own children, all of it perfectly, respectably legal. She wrote about her own case, bearing her private agony in public, itself a scandalous thing for a lady to do, because she understood that her particular suffering was a window onto a vast, hidden injustice that thousands of voiceless women endured in silence. And she did more than write. She campaigned. She lobbied. She used every connection she still had, every sympathetic politician, every man of influence she could reach, pressing her cause with a relentlessness that her enemies found unladylike and her allies found unstoppable. She was attacked for it, viciously, mocked, slandered, accused of every impropriety, told that a respectable woman would suffer in silence rather than air such things in public. She kept going anyway. And astonishingly, against the whole weight of the established order, she began to win. In 1839, in large part through her tireless campaigning, Parliament passed the Custody of Infants Act, the first crack in the ancient wall. For the first time in English law, a mother could petition the courts for custody of her young children, and for access to her older ones. It was limited, hedged, imperfect. It helped Caroline herself far too late and far too little, for her own sons were largely lost to her, and one of them would die in childhood while she was kept from him. But it was a beginning. It was the first time English law had ever admitted that a mother had any right to her own children at all. And Caroline Norton, ruined, slandered, robbed, had pried that admission out of a parliament of men with nothing but the force of her words. She did not stop. Over the years that followed she continued to write and to agitate, turning her own grief into a sustained assault on the legal machinery of coverture itself. Her later writings on marriage and divorce, fierce and lucid and impossible to ignore, fed directly into the great reforms that came, the laws, passed across the following decades, that began at last to give married women a legal existence of their own, the right to divorce on more equal terms, the right to keep their own earnings, and eventually the right to own their own property. Caroline did not live to see the full structure built, and she always insisted, with a bitter honesty, that she was no champion of women's equality in the abstract. She did not argue that women were the equals of men, only that the law's treatment of them was a cruelty no decent nation should permit. But whatever she called herself, the truth is plain. Her fight, born out of one woman's private catastrophe, helped to crack open the law of England and let in, at last, a little light for every wife who came after her. It is worth pausing, in the quiet, on the sheer reach of what she set in motion, because it stretched far beyond that first imperfect act. In the years that followed she kept writing, and her pamphlets grew bolder and more sweeping, long, reasoned, white-hot letters addressed to the Lord Chancellor, to members of Parliament, even, in one famous case, directly to the Queen herself, laying the whole grotesque architecture of the law before the one woman in England who sat above it. She wrote of how a married woman could not keep the money she earned with her own hands, how Caroline's own literary earnings, the fruit of her own pen, could be seized by the very husband who had cast her out, how a wife could be deserted and still have her wages claimed, slandered and still have no standing to defend herself, robbed and still have no court to turn to. She made the invisible visible. She took the 1,000 small daily cruelties that the law called normal, and she held them up to the light where decent people could no longer pretend not to see them. And the law moved. Slowly, grudgingly, over decades, but it moved, and her words were in the current that pushed it. The great reform of the divorce law that came in the 1850s, establishing, for the first time, civil divorce through the courts rather than only by the private act of Parliament that none but rich men could afford, was shaped in part by the force of her writing and the example of her case. And the later acts that at last gave married women the right to own property and keep their earnings, the slow dismantling of coverture itself, grew from the ground she had broken first. She always refused the grand banner of women's rights. She argued, with a kind of bruised practicality, only that the law as it stood was a barbarism unworthy of a civilized people. But history is not bound by what reformers call themselves. Whatever modest name she gave her fight, she had struck one of the first and hardest blows against a legal order that treated half the population as the property of the other half. The cost to her, personally, was never repaid. Of her 3 sons, taken from her and kept from her through her husband's spite, one died as a child, of an illness, untended, while she was barred from his side, a grief that no later triumph in Parliament could ever ease, and that she carried, raw, to the end of her life. She won, in the largest sense. She lost, in the most intimate one. Both were true at once, as so much in these women's lives was true at once. Her own life never fully healed. The years had cost her too much, her reputation, her peace, and above all her children, the wound that never closed. George Norton harassed and obstructed her to the end of his days, and only after he had finally died, when she was an old woman herself, was she at last free to marry again to a kind old friend, and she died just a few months later, in 1877, having found a small, late, quiet happiness at the very end of a long and bruising road. But measure her, for a moment, not by what the world cost her, but by what she left behind. Every right that a married woman in the English-speaking world would come to take for granted, the right to keep the money she earns, to own the things she buys, to be heard in a court, to have some claim on her own children, every one of those rights was built, brick by brick, over the generations that followed, and Caroline Norton laid some of the very first bricks, with her bare hands, while bleeding. She did it without the vote, which women would not have for generations yet. She did it without allies in any organized movement, for there was scarcely a movement to join. She did it armed with nothing but a great wrong, a brilliant pen, and a refusal to be silent that no amount of public shaming could break. There is a particular kind of courage in being the first, in standing up before there is any crowd to stand with you, in saying the unsayable thing, while the whole respectable world hisses at you to sit down and be quiet. That was her courage. And the quiet, ordinary freedoms that millions of women have lived inside ever since are, in part, her monument, though her name has faded and most who benefit from her fight have never heard it. And so, as the candle burns low, hold her with you a moment. Caroline Norton was, by birth, exactly what every debutante in this story was raised to become, a beautiful, witty, well-bred girl, married off young to a man chosen for her, expected to be ornamental and obedient and silent. And the gilded cage, for her, turned out to have iron bars. Everything the rules quietly threatened, the violence a wife could not escape, the children a mother could not keep, the voice a woman was not permitted to raise, all of it fell upon her at once. She was given the worst the system had to offer. And instead of disappearing under it, as it fully expected her to, she stood up, in the full glare of a hostile nation, and she named the injustice out loud, and she changed the law of the land so that other women would not have to suffer exactly as she had. She would not last a day, they might have said, as a quiet and obedient wife. They would have been right. And every mother in England who has ever kept her children owes a small, forgotten debt to the beautiful, furious woman who would not stay silent. And there our journey ends for tonight. We began the evening as a frightened girl in a white gown, curtsying before her queen, stepping out into a glittering world that wanted only one thing from her. And we leave it in the company of three real women, Jennie, who dazzled it, Lillie, who outwitted it, and Caroline, who fought it and changed it forever, each of them born into that same gilded cage, each of them, in her own way, refusing to be only what the world had decided she should be. So let the great house grow quiet now. Let the candles in the ballroom gutter and go dark, one by one. Let the carriages roll away into the night, and the music fade, and the long white gowns be folded away until tomorrow. There is nothing left for you to do tonight, and nowhere you need to be. The dancing is over. The watching is over. You may, at last, simply rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders sink down into the pillows. Let the warm dark settle over you like a blanket drawn up to your chin. The whole bright, anxious, glittering world can wait until morning. It always does. Sleep now. Rest easy, wherever you are, whatever the hour. And when you're ready, drift off gently into your own quiet dreams. I'll be here again tomorrow night, with another story from the soft, candlelit past, to keep you company in the dark. Until then, sweet dreams.